We're going to start this afternoon with 4 presentations and then a patient panel. The first speaker is Jordan Berlin, who will be talking about demystifying clinical trials, and he's from Vanderbilt University. So please give us a great round of applause for Jordan. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Here's this, and here's the screen.
Okay, fair warning, I did this talk last year, so if you recognize some of the slides and photos of my dogs, it's not my fault. I utilized my slides from last year. My job is to try and give you an idea of clinical trials. So while other people have gone through the data, and I'm going to show you some slides of data that you've seen before, the point isn't to necessarily talk to you about the numbers, it's to show what clinical trials are about. So first off, you need to know some of the language that we use, because I'm sure everybody who's been to the doctor has noticed that doctors all use different terms for the exact same thing. And if you're like our institution, where you can actually read your x-ray reports online, you realize that the radiologist can read the exact same x-rays and they look like 2 completely different reports. And that's because doctors train in different places and we're sadists. We have a lot of terminology. But some of the things that are important is that cancer is always a tumor, but a tumor is not always cancer. Technically, a wart is a tumor. A tumor means any growth, but doctors like to use a lot of things. Sometimes they have a tough time saying the word cancer, so they use other words like mass growth, lesion, nodule, and a slew of other terms. And some of it is also because when we see something on a scan, we don't know for sure what it is, so we won't call it a cancer. We'll call it a growth, or we'll call it a lesion, or we'll come up with some other word that might come from Latin, but usually not. So for this trial, when I'm talking about clinical trials, I'm talking about things that are really investigational trials, where we're trying to study something in a systematic way to learn how to do things better. That's our goal when we do clinical trials, is always to try and find something better. Okay? And to conduct the trial, we do use a protocol. The problem with that is that there are people who use protocols. We also use, quote, standard protocols. We have standard protocols for treating this disease or another in every institution. You have standard operating protocols or procedures at every job and business these days. And so that's why the word protocol can sometimes be confusing. Clinical trials should really be a systematic study that's designed to find something and learn something new. So, what is standard therapy? Standard therapy is what we do off of a trial. And how you get to a standard has a lot of different ways of getting there, but we have different words for standards also, or different types of standards also. So the standard is usually something that we do routinely off of a clinical trial that's done in large groups or around the country or around the world fairly commonly. It doesn't mean there aren't multiple standards. There are multiple standard regimens for treating stomach cancer, for example. I'm sure you've heard that today. I keep running out because I'm writing a grant. But the standard arm on a clinical trial or on a randomized trial usually is one of the things that we use commonly around this country or around the globe for treating disease. So how does something become a standard? Well, it usually has to win. That's not always the case. There's a standard therapy for lung cancer that's actually never beaten anything, but it's never lost to anything either. So we use it. But in this disease, it's almost always beaten something. Usually the comparison trial is against something else. Once in a rare while, we will have a trial that compares a treatment to a placebo. And that's actually happened recently with a drug called ramucirumab. Or not really placebo necessarily, but not using a cancer treatment once in a while. But most of the time, you're using a standard plus a new drug versus a standard plus no new drugs as the randomized trials. If there's something really, really good, and we had that in a tumor called gastrointestinal stromal tumor, a drug called Gleevec, when it's really, really, really good and so obvious that it's better than anything else that we've ever had, you don't necessarily need a trial where you compare something. That doesn't happen very often, but with Gleevec it did. We actually compared Gleevec to Gleevec in the randomized trials. We used one dose versus another because it was so darn good. Next, we have the terms of chemotherapy versus other therapies. Doctors, everybody hates chemotherapy, right? That's very commonly known. Most everybody's scared of chemotherapy. They all remember terms of endearment where Deborah Winger suffered through chemotherapy. We've gotten better at chemotherapy, and really people shouldn't suffer through therapy. The therapy should not be worse than the disease. That's my firm belief. But chemotherapy actually now refers to drugs that are geared to injure or kill dividing cells. It's a very logical thing because cancer cells divide and grow faster than any other cells. So targeting the DNA or things that move the DNA around the cells are really what chemotherapy is. We have these other drugs that we couldn't figure out a good name for. They target proteins mostly, and they're called biologics or targeted agents. It's not that chemo doesn't have a target. It has something it aims at. So targeted agents wasn't really such a good thing. And pretty much everything we give is technically biological. So I'm not sure biological is such a good name. But because we can't come up with a good name, we keep flipping around between biologics and targeted agents. Ramucirumab, for example, which just got approval, is a targeted agent, whereas Taxol is a chemo agent. Then there's immune therapy, and that is very different because it targets the immune system. It tries to make your own immune system actually act against the cancer. And there are drugs being developed in immune therapy. There are none actually approved by the FDA right now for this disease, but there are drugs being developed for this. Once we get through all the terms, we'll get to the trials. The other terms, stage, a lot of people are always curious what their stage is. It's classically 1 to 4, and then we get a little few letters in between. The trials are phases 1 to 3, and I'll go through those in a minute. It refers to clinical trial phases, and then we've got another thing we call adjuvant therapy. Adjuvant therapy means we've cut out the disease, and we can't see anymore. We've treated the disease definitively, and we're trying to give something to mop up the cells we can't see, the invisible cells that we think are there, and they're the ones that are at risk for coming back. Because the truth is, once you've cut something out, it can't come back. Okay, unless somebody goes down to the pathology lab, brings it back up to show it to you. It's going to stay downstairs in the pathology lab. Only cells that are hiding in microscopic size somewhere in your body can come back, and that's what we're trying to clean up with adjuvant therapy. So, let's go to clinical trials. And again, I separate sections with my dog pictures. I use the same dog pictures. By the way, I'm not on Facebook, but she is. And she's got quite a following, too, I got to tell you. So what are clinical trials? Well, we need to know something about a drug to use it. So we need to know what the right dose is, right? We need to know what the side effects are. And most importantly, we need to know whether it helps and how it helps. We'd like to know how it helps. Some drugs help by shrinking tumors, and some help by just controlling tumors. In the end, our goal isn't to make CAT scans look prettier. It's to make people live longer and better quality of lives. Okay? And sometimes we sacrifice side effects because we know that overall we maintain a longer quality of life by giving the chemotherapy, even though it has some side effects, compared to not giving a chemotherapy. So realize that we're trying to balance the risks and the benefits whenever we're looking at these trials. So how do you decide what the dose is? Well, this is usually the phase 1 trial. Phase 1 trial is a dose escalation trial. We start with a dose, we give it to a few people. If they tolerate it well, we give it to a few more. Some people say our goal is to cause side effects, because the truth is we go until we get so many side effects that we say, whoa, that's too much. And then we back down. And that's the reality of a phase 1 trial. Now, these days, we actually know a little bit more about the drugs, and we actually aim for doses where we get enough dose into the body, we think it's the biologically effective dose. In other words, it will target people. So we don't always go for too many side effects anymore. It gives us a hint of the effectiveness, and more we're looking at more things. We make patients go through biopsies. We make patients go through extra x-rays, experimental CAT scans and PET scans and MRIs. You won't believe the number of things we can do to a person on these trials, but it's all very important because it helps us figure out whether this drug is really effective early on, and we can throw away the drugs earlier rather than wait until later. The longer we wait, the more patients we need, and the less drugs we can test. So trying to figure out whether a drug's truly effective early eliminates some of the drugs that aren't effective, because guess what? There are more drugs in development today than there probably were in the entire 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s combined. And there are more unique drugs in development today than any other decade in past. So that's very important. We treat very few patients on those phase 1 trials, and we get some clues, but we really need to know a little bit more about whether or not it's effective. And usually this involves a phase 2 trial. We use one dose, one disease type, one setting. That might be people who have never been treated before. It might be people who have had one prior treatment before or 2 prior treatments before. We try to get a kind of uniform group so we can decide whether or not this is effective compared to what we used to see. Or sometimes we'll even do what's called a randomized phase 2, where we compare one treatment to another in a smaller group of patients. It gives us a signal of how effective it is and gives us more information about how toxic the drugs are. And we find out if the dose we found is really effective. Sometimes one group of patients won't tolerate the drugs as well as the group of patients we treated on the phase 1 trial. So sometimes we learn that we have to change the dose that we once used. So phase 2 gives us a pretty good idea if it works or not, but the real truth is we need to test it against the gold standard to know whether or not it works. And this is a little bit more complex because phase 3 requires a lot of patients. It randomizes the new drug or the new drug plus old drugs versus the standard, which is often the old drugs. It proves if a drug is really better or not, and it's definitive, meaning it tells us for sure whether or not it's better. Yes, we can get borderline results. That's the nature of the world. But for the most part, it tells us whether or not this drug should go further and whether or not it gets approved. It's usually the phase 3 trial that goes to the FDA and gets a drug approved. So, what are the endpoints? And that's my other dog. He is not on Facebook. He's shy. So, one of the endpoints is survival. That's the most important one. How long do patients live? Do we make them live longer? Because that's really our goal. Our goal is to cure people. So you think that that would be living infinitely, but of course none of us live infinitely. So the goal is to make people live longer. Sometimes, especially when we've removed the disease and we're trying to look at adjuvant therapy, meaning after we've removed everything, we'll look at disease-free survival or how long before the tumor comes back. Because the longer the time before the tumor comes back, the better off people are because they're off therapy and they're living a long life and they're living healthy. Progression, that's what disease-free survival, relapse-free survival is. Progression-free survival is when we start people on trial that actually have disease that we can see. How long does it take before the tumor starts growing? There are a few other endpoints, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Response rate is another one that we've used a lot, especially in the phase 2 setting, and that's shrinkage of disease. The problem with response rate is some of our drugs don't do that. What about how we decide whether or not it's effective? Well, we used to look at median, which is the average time, but now we look at something which is hazard ratio, which is much more devastatingly complex. It's actually comparing a line to a line and saying, is this line better than the other? And you end out with a ratio, usually 0.8 or 0.7 or 0.6, and you go, is it better or not? And is that a good enough difference? 0.8 means it's an 80% chance that you're going to do better, basically. And that might not be good enough. So here's a trial. Again, this is something called magic trial. And when we look at things, we want to see that that p-value is less than 0.05. That means that there's less than a 5% chance that the results happen by chance. In this case, it was only a 0.9% chance that the results were by chance. And the hazard ratio was 0.75. But if you look at the median, they didn't separate by that much. If you look at the 12-month survival, they're not separated at all. It's later on that the survival changed. This is another trial that was positive. In this case, the hazard ratio was reversed. In other words, it's 1.293 really corresponds to about 0.7 if we looked at it a different way. But the bottom line was that right at the 50% mark, the two arms kissed. But they stayed separated most of the time. So the truth is that this trial was a positive trial, but if you just looked at median, you didn't see much of a benefit. If you looked at hazard ratio, there was benefit for the patients that overall the chance that they'd live longer was there. This is yet another one where you can clearly see the curves stay separate, so it's actually easier, and both the median and the overall survival look separated. Bottom line is, we have to look at the whole curve and see how patients do as a whole group rather than just how one person does or one time point in life. And focusing on the median was something we used to do. We've gotten smarter. We no longer focus on it. So what's informed consent? How do you get on a clinical trial? You get on a clinical trial because your doctor talks to you about it, suggests it to you, and then you have to learn about it. And it's a process that unfortunately the federal government got themselves mixed in with, so it's really complex. The average consent form runs about 18 pages long, most of which is all crap, frankly. But it's important crap in some ways. And the important parts about it are, why are we doing the study? What's done on the study? The problem with the federal government is we also tell you what we would normally do that we're also doing on the study. And that's where it gets confusing. What are the risks? What might the alternatives include? And what might the benefits of the study be? So again, the government has proven that the group of them are far dumber than each of them alone, because the individual people are nice people. In an effort to make us informed patients, we've gotten too complex, and the informed consents are really long, but the bottom line is you need to ask your doctor, what's the bottom line? So, I hope in this short time I've given you some idea what clinical trials are. They're not as complex as they seem. Okay, those consent forms make them seem real complex. The idea is to find something better. And the things that you need to learn are, what are the chances that it'll be better? What do you know so far? And what are the risks I'm going to take by doing this? Okay, because there are going to be risks. We just try to make it seem complex. The word regulatory means that somebody's not only overseeing but adding to the paperwork. Okay, your doctor should be able to bring the trial down to the essentials, and then I still think it's important to read the consent because the details are important. Clinical trials are the future. That's how we've made every advance so far, and that's how we will make every advance in the future until we figure out something different, and I don't think we will. So I'm all done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Berlin. Do we have any questions from the audience? We have a question in the back.
Either that or I baffled you all. Okay.
And then we have one on the side.
Should patients go into clinical trials when the therapies they've tried don't work any longer? How does a patient know when to go into a clinical trial?
So that's a great question, because one of the most important things is clinical trials should be considered, if available, every step of the way. The truth is that we are not curing our patients 100% of the time. Until we're done doing that, then we won't need clinical trials anymore. And the reality is that clinical trials should be every step of the way. So it should be the first thing we think of, it should be the last thing we think of. And places like where I work at Vanderbilt have clinical trials for most of the steps, not every patient, okay? Sometimes we have HER2 positive trials, sometimes we don't, but we can talk to people about the clinical trials, and we can also tell them whether or not we have clinical trials nearby that might not be at our institution. It's a hard thing sometimes for doctors to talk about the trials that aren't at their institution, because that says, I'm going to send you somewhere else. But if it's the right thing to do, it is. Clinical trials are always an attempt to try and do something better, but they do have risks. But I believe that they should be considered as standard option every time we talk to a person.
Research institutions. So my question sort of is, how has the funding been affected by the cutbacks? Is NCI holding up, and how much is the private pharmaceutical and other R&D type programs fit into this?
Well, there are a lot of things affected by cutbacks. Even the pharmaceutical industry is affected by them, because the truth is that money is not infinite anymore. We have all been affected by it. The federal government has cut back its involvement in clinical trials in some ways, and certainly the grants to do new research have gone way, way, way down. In fact, actually, probably most people would think we're all crazy to be in a job where we have about a 10% chance every time we submit a grant of getting a positive result and getting the money, because that's how our basic researchers live. But a 1 in 10 chance when you're filling out 25 and 50-page grants. They say they're only 12 pages long, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes in. I submitted a grant to do the cooperative group trials, which is still a real key element of the federal dollars, and it was about 500 pages long, largely tables. The government likes a lot of information. They might not use it, and they might not even read it, but they like a lot of information when you submit something. But bottom line is that we're also getting more efficient, And sometimes getting rid of some of that extra money might make us smarter in that we have to take the best. So maybe we won't be looking for little incremental benefits anymore, and we have to look for the real winners. And it's true for the drug companies too, because you're not as assured of getting FDA approval for something that makes a small difference, and you really need to get the real winners now. So there are some benefits for the cutbacks as well.
Hi, I've just been accepted into a clinical trial.
Well, thank
but
you
have
for
not
doing that.
started yet. My question is, there are other options as well, and so it's a risk.
Right.
But I've been told that the benefits will be, that it's a good bet, this clinical trial. My question is, after, apparently it's supposed to be a 1-year, trial, 12 months, which is always a nice thing. But anyway, but what if the drug is no longer available, is not FDA approved?
So a lot of times the drug companies, if they have a 1-year trial, will actually have an extension trial that they add on in case they're not FDA approved. You'd have to talk to the doctor about the individual trial you're on, but that usually happens with most trials these days. It's not a guarantee. Certain situations, we don't want to continue the drugs forever. We want to give you breaks from them because side effects can build up over time, so they might not always have that. But odds are that at the time your clinical trial is done, if it's the one that's supposed to get FDA approval, there won't be an FDA approval because the trial has to be completed, the data has to be analyzed, and of course we actually have to wait until all the outcomes are back before they can even start filling out the FDA submission, which is another 1,000-page document. It is not easy for a drug company to submit to the FDA, so they take it very seriously, and a team will spend 6 months to work on the submission. Is that about accurate, Livia?
Yes.
Yeah. It's not just one person, it's a team where their whole lives are spent doing that submission. And then when they go to the FDA, they are going with every preparation they could possibly come with. I've even been hired to debate against an FDA approval in the past, just to make sure the company had every answer to every question. And because I'm very mean, and the drug companies recognize that in me. I hope that answers the question. But I can't know for sure. You can ask your doctor for yours specifically. But there's usually an add-on trial.
Any other questions? We have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jordan, the amount of money in research for cancer drugs, can you tell me approximately the percentage of that money that's invested by the drug companies as opposed to the government?
I don't think I know that. I don't know if anybody else knows that, but I would say the vast majority is from the drug companies now. The NIH budget is staying stable for the most part, which means it's decreasing because of inflation. And the NCI budget is what, $1 billion at this point, most of which is for cancer research, but all cancer research. But believe it or not, other parts of the NIH support cancer research. The Department of Defense has cancer research dollars. So there's a lot of other dollars from the federal government, and admittedly, they've provided a lot of funding for it. But the other thing about the pharmaceutical industry is the government's not known. I know you're going to all be shocked, but they're not known for efficiency. Just pass out now. So when drug companies have a drug, they're not going to rely on the federal government to develop their drug to get them to FDA approval, because remember, they have a limited patent life. So they need to get it approved as quickly as possible. So they're keeping the best drugs for themselves in the best indications because they want FDA approval faster, because they say that every day that it delays in FDA approval costs them like $30,000.
Yeah.
I think it's more than that.
Yeah, and just a comment, and that's everything we're talking about here is the reason why also this organization exists. With your help and support, we're raising money for being able to give grants for funding, and we gave our first this year, and the importance of all of us to help attend, go to Capitol Hill and really scream out and show that there's an importance here when it comes to stomach cancer, and advocacy is very important. So, we thank you all for being here and for support in the future for Advocacy Day.
Yeah, I'd like to say one other thing on that, is that you have to realize that there is a weakness to the pharmaceutical industry supporting the trials, and that although the trials are run completely independently and they don't bias the trial results, you can kind of bias the way the trial is written. So that it favors your drug. There was a drug for another disease where they actually used an old drug, 5-FU, in a way that's the least possible effective manner to test their drug against, and that helped them to win. And actually, I think their drug deserved approval regardless of that trial, but it's still, that you can do it. So you have to realize that there is some inherent bias, and we like the data better from independent grants, which the federal government is independent grants.
I want to pick up on the point that you made earlier, Jordan. Somebody asked about how much money is spent by the federal government on cancer research. So specifically, which is what Libya mentioned, the federal government spends $12 million on stomach cancer research a year, only 12 million. So we have to understand that as a stomach cancer community, that's the least amount of federal funding per death of any cancer. And yes, the Department of Defense does spend some money on cancer research, but stomach cancer is not included. And that is why we went to Capitol Hill. That was our message on Capitol Hill this past February. So we are trying to change all of that.
So there's a list of the 8 deadliest cancers, of which stomach cancer is one of them. And the 8 deadliest cancers account for more than 50% of cancer deaths in this country every year. And I think the numbers, they receive about 30% of the dollars. I will note that I think Vanderbilt has the vast majority of the stomach cancer research dollars. But we're largely looking into the etiology to try and prevent the disease. We do have therapeutics as well. So, it's important to realize that dollars have not been divided up by cancer, by how many deaths they cause, how many incidences they cause. And the cancer that gets the most money is breast cancer, and it is not an overfunded cancer. Please don't think that they get too much money for research. They don't, but they get more than the other diseases. They've had a lot more advocacy than any other group, and that shows that advocacy matters.
Yep. We have go ahead.
If I may return to a question I asked earlier about when to go into a clinical trial. Why would a person want to go into a clinical trial without first trying regimens that have already been approved? They're going into something unknown that may work, may not work.
Well, it depends on the setting, and that's a good question. So it's unusual for us to suggest you go into something completely new when we have something that's proven to make people live longer. Usually in those settings, we're actually giving the stuff that we already know works plus the new drug. So it may give you a benefit above and beyond the therapy. The risk, of course, most often the most common risk for doing something like that is that, of course, that drug might not be better and it might add side effects. But that's the risk that we take. But we usually, when we're going through that, we have good data in the laboratory or in preliminary data from other patients suggesting that this treatment does look like it will be more effective. And so we add this new drug to the old drugs. That's usually the most common situation when there are available other drugs. The truly experimental, what I do for a living at Vanderbilt, in addition to gastrointestinal cancers, phase 1 trials are usually reserved for patients who have gone through all the therapies. Having said that, of course, for example, I've got 3 phase 1 trials with a regimen called FOLFOX plus a new drug, and all of them we've put first-line stomach cancer patients on because that's a good first-line therapy for stomach cancer.
Any more questions? We have a question online. This person writes, are you aware, I'm sorry, I'm going to start here. What are your views on the current phase 1 trial named MEDI 4736.
I have no idea what trial that is. I apologize. There are currently going on in this country about 500
Yeah.
phase 1 trials, and I can't possibly know
Okay.
names to all of them. I apologize.
Okay, so in more specifics, are you aware of any trials incorporating Herceptin with drugs to prevent slowdowns in heart function?
I'm not aware of
Right.
any to prevent the slowdowns in heart function. Most of the trials are trying to make Herceptin or drugs like Herceptin even more effective in patients with HER2 gastric cancer. So we're more looking at the effectiveness, but that is an important aspect.
Okay, we have one more question here.
Hi, I'm Ann Fonfa, patient advocate with the Annie Appleseed Project. My question is, why is the highest tolerable dose the one that's chosen? I ask this because I know that Xeloda, for example, was approved at a pretty high dose and now rarely used that way, but it's said that docs in the know are aware of this, which would sort of indicate there are docs who don't know to reduce dosage. I worry.
So the standard in the past has been to go to the highest effective dose, or the highest tolerable dose, and it's always been to go to the highest tolerable dose because that's what we thought would be most effective. Nowadays, with these new targeted agents, we look for biologically effective doses, so we actually don't necessarily go to the highest dose. Xeloda is a unique situation. Xeloda was actually tested mostly in Europe. As it turns out, by continent, the tolerance of Xeloda is different. So actually, the Asian continent tolerates Xeloda the best. Europe, somewhere not as well as Asia, but better than the US. In US, we really don't tolerate Xeloda at the full dose that was tested in Europe. There's another drug called S1 that's heavily used for gastric cancer in Japan and Korea that is not approved in the US that is similar, that the Asians tolerate much higher doses than we do. That does seem to be dietary factors, but we're not 100% sure. So we very rarely use the full dose of Xeloda from trials that were conducted ex-US, outside the US, in the US because of the fact that we just don't tolerate the drugs as well. For 5-FU, there does, which is Xeloda is the pill form of 5-FU, sort of. Your body converts it to 5-FU. There does seem to be a threshold dose below which it loses effectiveness, but we don't know if there's that much of a dose response curve, meaning the higher the dose, the more effective. There are some drugs where super high doses get you some benefit in leukemia, for example. That's why we do bone marrow transplants in that disease. But we don't have super high doses that torture patients get you benefit. So a lot of doctors modify the doses, and in a lot of regimens we've had to modify the doses. We try not to lose the effectiveness by modifying.
Great. I'd like to go back to the last question about the MedImmune trial. We will have Edith answer that question, please.
So the question about the MEDI 4736, this is a phase 1 clinical trial, and Dr. Berlin has discussed what phase 1 clinical trial.
If it's open in my institution,
yes.
I'll be very embarrassed.
And the purpose of this study is to evaluate this new drug in patients with kidney cancer, colorectal cancer, and a few more. Non-small cell lung cancer is included, and so is gastric cancer, in patients whose tumor or disease is progressing on all therapies that they have been eligible for or have been treated with. And this drug is one of the immune modulators. It actually inhibits a protein called PD-L1, so it's a PD-L1 inhibitor, and it's a phase 1 trial that's ongoing at a number of institutions throughout the country.
Yeah, PD-L1 is one of the hot targets right now for the immune system. It basically tells the immune system to ignore whatever is there, the cancer, and they're hoping that by turning off PD-L1 that the immune system will wake up and say, hey, there's cancer there. We don't want that, but it's not that easy.
So as you can see, I think we had a discussion earlier by Jaffer Ajani about the excitement that's happening around immunotherapies. That's one of those new exciting immunotherapy agents that are being tested. So I hope we had, that was a question online. Anyone else have any other questions? Great, well, thank you very much, Dr. Berlin.
Thank you, and I apologize for disappearing for a few.